So early.
Hello, everybody.
Sorry. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, sorry.
Exactly.
That's your job.
That's my job.
Like, thank you.
This is Jessica Brillhart. She is the Principal Filmmaker for VR at Google. If you guys want, you can wear your headphones and get a even more intimate sound experience.
Hi.
So Jessica's going to take us through a lot of different things that she's been researching and experiencing through her work, and then afterwards I'm going to help with a Q&A and start a conversation with you guys. So
you're really here for emotional support.
I am here for emotional support.
In case I fall asleep, he's going to be like poking me with like a stick or something.
Yeah, there's a big stick right here.
Yeah. Cool. I wonder if, is it showing up here? Not seeing
You wanted
anything.
to see you there?
Well, it should show up here, but it's not. Let me see if it's should I?
There it is.
Oh, hey. There we go. All right, we're gonna go back. The slide that I skipped is actually not that interesting, but maybe we'll go back there for a second.
There we go.
No. Sorry, guys. 1 second.
How's everyone doing this morning?
Oh, there you go.
The basics.
Now we don't care. We cared 5 minutes now. This is like a really boring slide. I spent all that time just to get this up. One of the things I've been doing is exploring like the foundations of VR, right? Like the grammar of VR. How do we craft? I've been close to a lot of the technology. I've been working with this stuff for a little bit now. And we always go to these things and we always say, oh, it's a new medium and no one knows what's going on and we're all learning. And I think that's true. But I think that there are some things that are very fundamental to how we create VR and how we create stuff in the space. So I'm going to go through some of those right now. And before I was involved with VR, I was a filmmaker, a traditional filmmaker. How many of you are filmmaker folks? 3.
How many people make VR?
That's actually great. So this is going to, OK. So as a filmmaker, one of the things that I was very familiar with was, obviously the frame, right? And in the medium of film, you craft a frame, and that's your window to these worlds that you're creating, and it's the way that you tell your stories. In VR, it's an interesting thing, because the frame isn't some sort of premeditated thing. It's, in a lot of ways, it's alive. And it's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing. And that's kind of the point of it, right? And it's really because the thing behind the frame, the thing that's creating the frame is also very much alive, you hope, right? And that's the person that's in the experience is deciding where the frame is. So as a result, something that looks like this is a bit wrong, right? Actually, instead of seeing it as a frame, we're really trying to see it more now as worlds of potential frames. And the worlds themselves aren't really static either. They change, they flow, they evolve around someone who also changes, grows, and evolves with it. And the shift from frame to world, in terms of the way that we talk about VR, is very important. But the other thing that changes as well is this notion of the person that's actually in the experience, our audience, right? We've grown accustomed as filmmakers, or in a lot of different mediums as well, where you have this thing and then someone sits out there and observes the thing that you're presenting. So right now, you're out there with me. Jeremy, however, is on my world right now and is looking at you. So the relationship of these things has changed. So really, our viewer has become more like a visitor to these worlds, right? The way that we describe our audiences are very different. And really, the VR stuff that sticks, the stuff that's really interesting, is when the viewer, where the visitor and the world connect. And the connection is where the craftsmanship is, where the artistry lies. So, that changes a lot of things. One of the things that changes is this idea of editing. Now, when I first started to edit, I did a horrible job of it because I was seeing it a lot like this, which is, in the medium of film, it's frame to frame to frame, right? But if we're talking about worlds in VR, then it's more about worlds that extend from each other. You're creating a mini universe, and your job as an editor is to pull a visitor through that universe, compel that visitor to explore these worlds and to move through that universe herself or himself. So you wonder how to do that, right? We always talk about, well, how do we get them to look in the way we want them to look, in the direction that we want them to look, or how do we, get them to coordinate in a certain way with these worlds? And so it's a bit tricky, right? Because the whole point of VR is that someone has the capacity to engage with it how they feel compelled to engage with it. How, you deciding where they're going to look is like you deciding that there's a frame in this. And as we already talked about, there's a world of potential frames. So you really have to have a good understanding of what's happening in the entirety of the world, not just in one particular part of it. But if you can make bets on where someone might be engaging, you can actually do things in editing. We call it match on action, right? You have someone jumping in the air, then you match with someone falling to the ground. And it feels like a smooth shift from one world to the next. In VR, if you can determine where someone might be looking, in the following world that you take them to, you can meet that general engagement area with something else. And it becomes a conversation with that person. A way that I did this is, if anyone knows ice hockey, I barely do, but I made a film with the Montreal Canadian ice hockey team. It's a piece called Go Habs Go. And I actually do this in this shot, where it's the torch ceremony in the beginning. And so I place bets that someone's going to be watching the thing on fire. This is what I do. So, I could have gone to the rink, right? I could have said, okay, we're going to go from that thing on fire, the torch ceremony, to the rink itself, which is the point, right? But then you would totally have missed that guy. And that's sad, because he's probably the most amazing piece of the whole thing, right? So you can actually open up these worlds and allow for someone to explore areas of these worlds that they wouldn't normally explore, because they're basically being told, look this way. This is the most important thing. Another thing to also take in mind as well is that given an acknowledgement of where someone's looking and what you do to respond to it, you suddenly have a solution to a pretty intricate cipher, right? If you can identify points of interest, if you can identify where attention might lie, where someone might engage, and how you respond to those engagements, then you basically create this path through this universe. And that's editing, the discovery of a journey. It's easy in a situation like this to decide where someone might be looking. There's, one person walking up a glacier. He's the only one making a sound. He's the only human being on that planet, right? Unless you like benign glaciers, which I might, or axes, you will most likely be planting your attention there. I can place pretty good bets on that. But the world is complex. And there are a lot of things people could engage with or look at, and we do have to consider those things as well. So in this tram scene, you got windows, you've got people, you have things that they're engaging with as well. The tram is actually moving. So there are various things we could do here. And one of the things that I did with this particular shot, this is from a film called World Tour, which is the first thing I made. If you're looking out the side of the tram, I respond with a horse face. And if you're looking out the front or back windows of the tram, as you were saying, I extend that with same world, but I extend that with the kind of alleyway of the horse stable. And this was kind of a bit of an experiment for me, because I wasn't sure how it would work, to be honest. But my bet was, if you're engaging with something in a particular way, so if I'm not really looking at the window. When we are actually in a space, we engage with what's beyond the window, right? We see the window for a split second, and then we go past it. So one way I could edit or deal with it or respond to it is to extend that engagement in the following world. So I extend that engagement with that window to the horse stable, where you're basically looking down a long alleyway of this horse stable. Or I can respond to it with a horse face. And I know that works because people start giggling really loudly. That horse is magical. And now it doesn't always work out where there's two worlds that match simultaneously. This was a result of filming a lot of different things and deciding how this montage would work. And through doing that montage, this is where these ideas sort of stemmed and came to fruition.
So both of those are part of the same shot, the same world.
Exactly. So in the very same shot, if you decide as a person in that experience, I'm going to look out the window over here, I respond to that. If you decide to look out the window over here, I respond to that as well.
Yeah.
It's not like this window and no other window. Because if that person looks this way and it's some wall, It's like, you mean, that could also be part of the conversation as well, but it's actually kind of a sad conversation to have. Like, oh, I love this, and then wall, right?
Yeah.
Thinking very much about how someone engages mentally in an experience, how they're feeling is really important. And how you respond to that as a creator is also important. It's like any art form, right? Where, you can either decide you want to engage with somebody yourself or not. And that actually has ramifications moving forward. Another thing, too, is this idea of rebellion, which I quite like. Which is, sometimes there's a game designer, if anyone's played Myst before, one of the game designers for Myst said that he goes into these experiences and he will turn and look in the opposite direction to see what's back there, and generally there's nothing. And I think that's sort of the way that I've been engaging with experiences from here on out. The first thing I do, I will turn around just to see if they even care about that space at all. I think rebellion in general is actually a really nice concept, isn't it? That there isn't just one perspective in a world. There's multiple ways we can consider things, and this could be intentional, or it could be something that someone sees a tree back there and they think it's great, or a butterfly. Like I've seen that before. We do heat map tests sometimes on the stuff that I do just for for giggles, and you just see like randomly this little tiny speck of a heat map, which is probably representing one person, just sort of wander off. And I love that stuff.
And that's using the eye tracking, right?
That's eye tracking stuff. Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting social layer, actually. So I do this in this film called Resonance, where this is the whole point of the scene, is watching Kennedy perform this song. And if you engage with that, great, you did it. But if you decide to turn around, this is what I do. And that's her parents in the doorway. Now, I would even argue, from a cinematic perspective, this is more interesting. Because you hear Kennedy, her presence is very much known. Like she's sort of kind of kid playing the violin, and then you see the expression on her parents' face as they engage with it and respond to it. And
also draws you back to her, too.
It does. And suddenly you're just like, oh, what are they looking at? And then you just kind of keep going. So even if they land there first, the fact that the reveal happens when they look at her. And if you think about the way camera moves happen, right? If you think of the person as a camera, suddenly what you're really trying to do is coordinate that camera the way that would be interesting as a film. And so this, you can imagine like it's a reveal, right? And reveals are amazing. Because for us, I mean, the reason why we're so attached to that too is this idea of discovery. We discover elements in a place and suddenly we're more attached to the memories of those things. They become more a part of our experiences, more a part of us. So rocks are interesting because you can't really place any bets on anything, really. It's like, I call them the chaos rocks. Just because scenes like this are like large crowds of people, there's no one discernible. It's like going out in the middle of a concert or something, and then you can't really make out anybody. And again, chaos is actually quite nice. Because what this allows us to do is to not set any specific expectations for that person, right? Like you're forced right now, no, you're not really forced, but your purpose here is to watch me, right? Now, if you're in the middle of a crowd, you may completely turn off. Maybe you're listening to the song inside your head. Maybe you're thinking about what you're going to have for lunch. You're not really going with any sort of, you're not like engaging with any one thing with any sort of purpose. You're sort of just existing in the space. And that's a really important thing to do in a VR experience, I think, overall, because if you're just looking at stuff and engaging with things constantly, unless that's the point, you become kind of tired and fatigued. What's also good about rocks is that and it's in any video game you've ever played, which is you don't immediately go into a video game or a computer game, or a house for that matter, and are expected to know where the butter is, how much butter to put in the dish that you're making, and how to cook with this person. Now, maybe some of you do, I don't. But there's a cadence to how you introduce yourself to a new space, and a way that we culturally decide to bring someone new into a space too. In video games, it's simply like, can I eat this mushroom? Can I jump on this mushroom? What happens if I fall down the thing?
What does this button do?
Yeah, Mario Brothers, basically. So with every VR experience I do, something that's really important for me to think about is what's world one? What's like the way in? How do I allow for someone just to calm down for a second, to just breathe, to take in the environment, and perhaps to understand that they can turn as well? A lot of people, when they go in, they still kind of sick here, unless something pulls them away from that. So with this scene in World Tour, I land in the rock area, predicting that someone would just basically be like, OK, rocks, got it. And And in the following world, it's the glacier area with the glacier climber that's making a sound. And suddenly they turn, and there he is. And the reason I can bet on that is because, again, he is the only person in that world. He's the only person making a sound. And generally, we're, evolutionarily, too, we tend to want to know what the heck's going on behind us. Like, otherwise, we freak out. So you can kind of pull on, like, how we just react to things in life to then create more engaging experiences. Another thing as well is, this is from Google I/O like 2 years ago. It's amazing. I see this, and I'm like, God, it's been. There are different vibes to different worlds, right? So this is, he doesn't have time for you. So basically, this is, you feel like a piece of technology because you're at a trade show, and they basically see you as a piece of technology. You are getting picture taking of you. People are looking at their watches. They're kind of scowling. Some of them are excited, but not many. So you take something like that and you compare it with something like this. And this is actually the first stitch that the group of engineers who built the jump rig, the Google jump rig, this is the first one that they actually captured. And they're stoked that you work. Like, that's really the energy. It's just they walk around the camera. They kind of hang out. It's really comfortable. They throw things. And you feel great. Mm-hmm. Comparatively to the Google I/O one, where you really just feel like you're being scrutinized and, evaluated. This one is just like, you work. We love you. And it's such a different feeling and a different vibe. So I realized pretty early on that it's more than just what you're capturing, is what the energy is like in a space. Like how that energy actually resonates with you. And a lot of that has to do with how someone treats a rig in a space, right? The VR component, the presence moment, doesn't happen just when someone puts on a headset. It happens as soon as you press record on that rig. And so the familiarity of that rig in that space is actually really important.
So just so everyone knows, the movement here is a perceived movement of someone looking around the VR space.
Precisely, yeah. The unfortunate thing about doing presentations is you have to look at it from out here on here, and that's not really what VR is. Yeah. So this is the best I can do. But other than bringing a headset on here, I guess. Next time.
Next time.
Another thing to also consider, too, is people move in real life. Like, reality doesn't just completely disappear because someone puts on a headset. This is my friend Kareem's piece called The Enemy, that he was working on at MIT at the time. And there's a literal dance here. There's a literal coordination. And something to think about also is how much is a person moving? Like, you don't really want someone that could constantly spin around the whole time. That's a little bit uncomfortable. So thinking about comfort in the real world is also something that I think is very important. So something I also consider, too, is just like, what is the flow of movement? Like, what's the flow of physical movement? How am I creating a bit of a dance here, physically? So there's a mental dance to consider, an engagement flow. But there's also the actual physical presence of that person in the real world and how that might actually feed into the narrative as well. And this is what World Tour looked like, with all the colors and the dots and everything. I would not do this again for anything else, because it would drive me absolutely insane. But that's what it is for World Tour. And you think, OK, great, I got the basics done. We good. We're going to do some VR stuff. But something that I've also been thinking about a lot recently is this notion of perception, this notion that we all perceive differently. And we've evolved to perceive in a very specific way to allow for us to exist on this planet. And I think that as, again, another narrative layer is actually very important. It's not just what we're capturing. It's sort of the question of how and why as well. So I want to talk a little bit about perception. I'm by no means an expert on perception, but there are things that I think are really interesting, and I've had the chance of working with some really great folks. I think they did it. The talk was yesterday, 2 days ago?
Yep.
With the artist and machine intelligence team at Google, who are awesome. And Deep Dream was a thing that everyone was sort of releasing at the time, and they were talking about a lot. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, OK, that seems pretty interesting. And as a result, one of my engineers on the jump team, actually, on the VR team, sent me this image of the rocks that you saw earlier that he had dreamed up using the neural net, trained neural net that he that became. I think it was like it was released.
Yeah, it was released a couple of years ago.
Um,
Can you explain to everybody what it does?
Yeah. Oh yeah, sure. So Deep Dream is, oh god, I'm gonna butcher this. I wish Ken were here. It's basically, I'm gonna give you like the layman's terms here, but it's a system that was trained using images, and it was actually originally trained to be able to do the enhance thing. So like you'd see a pixel on a blurry image and go enhance, and suddenly it become clear, and you could see the full person, and it would basically make sci-fi a real thing. But then they reversed it, and suddenly you have like the system basically seeing this pixel and then building up on it, and suddenly you had things happen like puppy slugs and, I don't know, eye mountains and possum ostriches and things like that. And so for a lot of us, it was like kind of interesting. Suddenly you had these really bizarre dreams that the system was having. And the system wasn't actually dreaming up anything. It was doing exactly what it was told. But it, for us, we were like starting to like imprint upon it some sort of mystical, mind thing.
The team calls it actually hallucinations, don't they?
They might have, yeah, at first, yeah. Oh, yeah, they actually do. They call it yeah. I think it's important to note, once I got this, I was like, have you tried putting this in VR? And my engineer said, I don't know how. Because we basically have stereo imagery on our rig, so there's a slight pixel difference. So the top will always look different than the bottom if we did this on both. Someone else that was actually on the Google Brain team gave me this one as a response, which is more to say that even given intelligent systems, you can still switch parameters. You can make puppy slugs into pagodas. It doesn't mean that just because you have this system, you just slap it on, right? There is a nuance. There is an artistry to this that could be really powerful if dealt with beautifully, I guess. So two of the projects I actually have here that are complete experiments, they're by no means finished things at all, it's a project that I did with Doug Fritz, who actually figured out a way to create stereo deep dream imagery in VR. The first is this thing called Waterfall. Douglas Eck, who was here also a couple days ago, has been doing work with generative music. This idea, the notion of can a machine perform music the same way as a human? And the answer quickly is no, not yet. But something I wanted to bring into the examples were audio examples as well of things that intelligent machines were doing. I don't know if it's not really playing. There you go. So the beginning part of this is a machine. And it plays during the dream, I guess. You sense where the human comes in, right? So the whole idea was just, could you transition from machine to human, this like kind of conversation of, something that seems really alien because something that's quite beautiful and different. So the second piece is called Arecibo, and this was our ability to actually make it into 4K. We're like, woo, 4K, like, because we're doing low res and putting that through. I went to Arecibo when I was filming World Tour, and one of the cameras on the rig didn't work, so the stitches came out all weird. But one of them wasn't so bad. And I put that with this really awesome guy, Ross Goodwin, who does this Word camera, where he basically trains systems on like Vonnegut and Faulkner, and it basically evaluates an image and then spits out prose based on like the stuff that it learned from those authors. So I fed Vonnegut, or he fed Vonnegut to it, and came up with this.
Hi guys.
A view from the window of a planet. The sun was green and we were there, with the two cars in the bottom of the moon and the water that were like the flame of a single dark river. Now the river stands above the moon. A view from the window of a planet. How do I know about this? The melody becomes all men. One actor in conversation is conditioned with the want of being open. It's hard work that has a man in it. This new man is not like the boy, but they are not creative enough. Nope.
Okay, you get it.
So
But
did you choose the Irish accent?
no, so Ross said that the Irish accent was the more, it's like it was the more engaging one. So Myra is the name of the voice that we chose. And you have to like slow it down slightly too. Just because if you're getting that kind of like
Weirdness.
stuff from like TED, you know, you're just a bit like, no. So it's also thinking about like what is the medium through, like what is the voice through which? I mean, you think that about that in Siri, think about that with that in a Google Assistant as well. Kind of like who's talking to you? Like we want to create a person behind that thing as well. So that was a really interesting tension because we tried a couple of voices and hers was the most listenable, I guess.
Do you think it's because of the inflection of the accent?
Yeah, absolutely. The roundness of it, the softness of the way that she handled that wording, you know. Imagining Vonnegut actually, you know, creating or saying that would be kind of interesting, right? So perception, you know, we've evolved to perceive a certain way. I think systems can actually help extend that, but also there's this notion that I've been really thinking about you know, disability. We don't all perceive the same way, but somehow we have established a normalcy of perception that is maybe unfortunate and is something that we should probably put front of mind. And this is not to necessarily talk to that specifically, but it's more to say that some VR, I actually think immersive experiences don't have to be photorealistic, you don't have to speak whale, you don't have to have haptic suits. I think that there's some really great things you can do with very little. This is something that I made in 4 hours because I was like, it's like taking forever to me to make other stuff. And if anyone knows about the Weather Channel, at all, yeah. So in the States, there's this channel you can watch, and all it is the weather.
24 hours a day.
24 hours a day. So they show you, like, you know, weather in various parts of the world, and they show you a local, you know, forecast as well. So I was like, I was like having these moments where I like miss my childhood. I'm like, oh, I miss like being on like with my mom and like watching TV. I'm like, why don't I want the Weather Channel? So I just took 4. I made it. Weather you can always turn to. It's kind of perfect. So another part of the Weather Channel is that Kenny G is featured in it a lot. It's really good.
It's really good.
So it's called Conditions at Omaha because it's all the windows or panes are from YouTube, and they're all from Omaha, Nebraska. And there's this whole series of people capturing the Weather Channel. Oh yeah, if you sit on your back and you look up, you see Kenny G playing. That's the Easter egg. It's my friend Ollie from. Okay, we can stop that. My friend Ollie from Tehran actually saw it, was the first to respond to it, and he's like, I don't know what this is, but I love it. And I was like, which dude? So you know, I started realizing, and the response I got was kind of incredible. Like, I was like, Google had nothing to do with that. Like, I was like trying to step away, but it's, The Verge picked it up, and they're like, this is like, there's no reason for this not to exist, even though we never asked for it. Kind of this like odd, like, we wouldn't necessarily expect this, but we're glad that it's here. And oddly enough, a week later, AccuWeather released a VR app. Yeah. Oh, I forgot. Kenny G retweeted it.
Nice.
I was like, I can retire. No. He also does this thing where he tweets. He uses sax instead of sex. So he'll say like, check out that sexy man in VR. And so I was like, I got the pun too. It was great. But AccuWeather released their app, and what they did is they ported AccuWeather stuff directly into VR. And the response from The Verge was like, dystopic future of this weather app, like versus mine where it was like, this is cool.
Yeah.
And it's essentially doing the same thing. Well, this is like, you know, multi-weatherverse of Omaha, but it's, I think like, you know, thinking about how we don't need the literal, how we can, you know, create imaginative spaces without much. And thinking just about what's true to the actual experience, how we can stick to that truth is important. So very quickly, this project I'm working on, there's a special preview of it in the Dome, but just Beethoven's Fifth. And I'll explain that in a second. There is something called the Golden Record. It's the 40th anniversary this year, and the project's called Voyager. And just real quick in photos, there were 2 probes, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, that were launched to do experiments on the outer planets of our solar system. One of them took a photo of Earth. It's the pale blue dot photo, if anyone's familiar with that. And on it is this golden record. And on this golden record is a group of images, sounds, music, greetings, and so on that represent the breadth of experience and life on Earth. And it was a message so that if these probes are meant to go into interstellar space, one actually is there right now. And when they're completely inoperative, they're just going to float like bottles with this message on them for billions of years.
So the record's glued to the side of the...
Yeah, it's a phonographic record, too, so that tells you a little bit about the time, right? And it looks a little something like this. I know, this idea of worlds that was really getting to me, this notion that, everything that we see, everything that we touch, everyone that we talk to is in itself a world of experience, right? Like right now, this is a world. If you go out there, that's a world. And we're in this state where we have tons of these worlds, and we've barely visited any of them. And a lot of the misunderstanding and the misconnections between each other, I think, comes from that notion that we're aliens on our own planet. So I thought, well, that makes a lot of, if we have, if this record is meant to take people from out there and bring them here, then surely, now that we have VR, maybe that record can serve the same purpose for us here as well. So the disability notion comes into this piece I did called Beethoven's Fifth, which is one of the chapters. And it's music, and Beethoven was a big part of the record. I'm flipping through these quickly, Simon.
No, take your time.
And something I was thinking about, too, is, Beethoven, music and how we hear, especially, and we know this being here as well, hearing gives us so much. Like, we get transported immediately somewhere else. We can go inside our heads. We can connect with worlds. We engage. We disengage. It's violent. It's graceful. And Beethoven's Fifth is really all of those things at the same time, right? And it serves that for people who can hear. But then I started thinking, well, what about those who can't? Beethoven was going deaf when he was writing this. So surely there's something within deafness, too, and ways that we can embrace that in the virtual space that could then maybe say more or allow people to experience on a deeper level music. And there's this book by Oliver Sacks called Seeing Voices. And there was an experiment done with a group of Chinese children who could hear and see, and then a group that could not hear. What they did is they took a laser pointer and they drew Chinese characters in a dark room. And it was unquestionable how much better the deaf children were at understanding what those characters were. So this is the deaf children, and this is the children who could both see and hear. What Oliver Sacks calls it movement parsing, and it's this notion that when you go deaf, and this is why sign language is very important, you actually don't see movement the same way. Your brain reshapes itself. And suddenly, a wave is multiple steps of a wave all at once, like a long exposure of a photograph. The one on the left is actually on the record, is of a gymnast from Time magazine, which I thought was an interesting connection there between the gymnast and Beethoven's Fifth on the record, which wasn't made before. Another thing, too, is I got kind of weirdly accosted by a professor, I guess you do this, at MIT, which was, he told me that he got very excited because he's like, Helen Keller. I was like, what? He's like, Helen Keller connected with Beethoven by putting her hand against a radio and feeling the vibrations. That's how she understood Beethoven. And beautiful accounts of it. There's Letters of Note, if any of you know that site. If you look up Helen Keller's note to, I think it's NPR, you can read it. It's really, really, really beautiful story. She understood pain, she understood longing, and she got to a point where she's like, he was deaf like me, and I can hear him. So there's this indirect notion, or maybe Beethoven was really the composer for the deaf. In his deafness, maybe he wrote music for those who couldn't hear as well. And then again, it's like, we don't really perceive nearly as much as is out there, and we saw this already. The notion that there are intelligent systems that can, know maybe a little bit more about the world than we do, or know the world differently than we do. So I thought, well, does Voyager as a probe maybe sense something that's different than we could ever sense ourselves? And so this is really interesting. This guy, Dr. Ed Stone pointed me to this guy, Don Gurnett. There's an instrument on Voyager that can read space sounds. And this is the sound of interstellar space. That's not sonified data. That is audio in space, in interstellar space. So I was like, well, clearly, I need to incorporate this somehow. And what really struck me, oh no, we don't see that yet, was that Beethoven had tinnitus, and it's a ringing in the ear. And something that was very strange was how that ringing of tinnitus and the sounds of interstellar space, when played back to back, sounded like whales calling to each other. So there's this interesting notion of homecoming. Like maybe he heard something that we couldn't. Maybe there was something in his genius or something in that that was connecting to another part of the universe that we aren't aware of anymore. So it became this project where basically I felt that it needed to be a journey. It needed to be something that spoke to various disability. It needed to focus on what hearing really means to us. This is a visualization of going into interstellar space that's taken from data from Voyager 1. That provided part of the journey as well. So basically, and if you go in the dome, you can see it in a dome. You should see it as a VR experience, I think. But it's a performance by the... It's a performance by the London Philharmonia Orchestra, and you travel into interstellar space. Incorporating movement parsing as well. So it's pretty trippy. But it's, and we also incorporated a haptic suit as well. So someday you'll be able to, I don't know what, you'll be able to experience with a haptic suit. It's great. We actually had, I did this premiere of it at Sheffield this past week. I had people who were blind that were going in and experiencing it, people who were deaf. I mean, just they were like, a Beethoven to them is so important, especially considering the idea of vibrations and considering it's a way for them to connect to music in a whole new way. And so that was something that was really important. And this is the last thing, is the idea that if the doors of perception are cleansed, then everything is infinite. And I think that there's something really beautiful about focusing more attention on the way that we experience the world and really finding beautiful ways of creating art around that. So yeah, that's sorry, did I go over time?
No, you didn't go over time. We have 2 minutes for questions. So does anybody have a question? You have Jessica here, and you're not going to ask her a question? I'm not going to let you guys leave till someone asks a question. Okay, go ahead.
That sounds awful.
Do you? We have a microphone
It's also still
coming.
early, by the way. Yeah, like fall asleep.
Sorry, I was a bit late, so maybe you covered it earlier. But I was wondering why all the images are super psychedelic and multicolored when.
Oh, the deep dream situation? Yeah, it does. I don't know. No, I mean it's basically taking the color sampling from that area. You can change that parameter too. But yeah, it's like, it kind of just depends on what kind of parameter or setting that you do for it. I think they were going for trippy as possible for this, just because they were like cranking it to 11. They're just like, see how far we can go. But things like, the finer details, like we saw some differences. Like you can make out birds and eyes and so on, and you can create bigger objects as well, but it also depends on the detail of the actual image. So like, it will map onto it. So if it's too fine a detail, you see the actual image again, and you don't see the dream as much. There's some metaphor in that. I don't know what it is, but.
Anybody else? One here and then one in the back really quickly. Okay.
You showed us that thing with the horse face.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, how did you trigger that transition? Was it by the user looking, or was it just part of the film sequence?
It's the sequence of it. So like, I think that there's a lot of, I've been working with interactivity recently too, and I think there's a lot of interesting thing to do, especially when it comes to editing and active and reactive editing, when you give someone the agency to do that and when not to. The current limitation of the medium is that we basically capture a bunch of these, 360 worlds with these, camera rigs, and then editing becomes, not so, like you have to almost, again, that's like the prediction of who's going to engage with what in what space, and then how you respond to that. So this isn't like reactive to them specifically, but it's just predicting. I called it probabilistic experiential editing because I'm a nerd and I like things like that, except that if the acronym is P, so I stopped doing that.
Before we answer the question in the back, there's one quick question I want to ask you.
Yeah.
you talked, we've talked about this before, like the camera positioning
Yeah.
of putting the audience in the world is important.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. So I've been going back and forth on it. It depends on if you're meant to connect with someone specifically in a space. I've always found that, you know, obviously the height of a camera is really important, right? If you're child height, looking up at an adult, like the act of looking up like this, is a very particular relationship. Now, if you heighten that to an adult and you look down on a kid, again, there's that change, that shift in relationship too. So height is very important, for sure. It's how we decide to engage with someone. Either we're, you know, submissive or we're authoritative. The Beethoven's Fifth piece was an interesting one because we're always saying, like, keep your camera level, just for sickness reasons and so on. What I realized was, I sound like my dad now. It's like some hippie nonsense. But the idea of, you know, energy and how we direct energy at each other is actually quite important as well. So in the experience, you're actually on a slight angle. So the camera was never this. It was always a little bit like this or like this, depending on where the orchestra members were sitting and where the positioning of the rig was in the room. And the reason was when you turn and you look, you're immediately looking at him, looking down on you like this. But as soon as you turn this way, you're looking down. So suddenly you're two people at once.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we did tests where we kept it this and then we angled it. And unanimously, people liked it angled, which is crazy because usually people like it, you know, like
Flat,
this. Yeah, but it's because of that eye line and that directness. It's sort of like that canted angle suddenly becomes this that becomes okay. You know, and we're seeing this a lot with a lot of film grammar. We're able to achieve things. A lot of the things that film does really well in VR, but we just have to rethink why we do it, and then it becomes something different. But you achieve very similar results in it. Yeah.
You have time for one more in the back?
Hello. So my question is about distribution and the headsets. Yesterday you mentioned how the headsets are bulky still, and so how is that going to evolve? And is there also a space for more collective experiences in VR, like what we're seeing at the Dome, or
Yeah,
how
I mean,
these two trends working together?
Yeah, that's a lot. I'll try to. I wish I had the answer to distribution. I do feel very strongly that the people who need VR the most aren't getting it, and to me, that's actually really. I come from, again, from a small town person, so I believe in that stuff. I think that you'll see. I think people are trying to figure out how headsets even fit in their lives, if they do at all. It is another level or layer to deal with. I mean, in my perfect future, there are no headsets. Maybe something as simple as a pair of glasses, which is funny because Google Glass, you know, maybe before its time was, you know, around. But I think, you know, the idea of, you know, stuff using infrastructure we already have, like the web, I think is really important. We're seeing, like, you know, PS4 headset sales are crazy good, and they're doing it because it's as easy as going on Amazon and just getting another controller, right? It feels more like it fits within something that someone already has. So I see that, like, it's going to get, I think that stuff is just, you know, we've seen the evolution of headsets. It's gone very rapidly, and I think anything that's cumbersome will be be easy and better very soon. In terms of dome projections are very different, but they're very beautiful. I love the planetarium. Like, showing stuff in a planetarium has been awesome. Like, I did that once, and I was like, yeah. It's a whole new medium because you're dealing with like the quality of the projections, the quality of the domes, and like Beethoven is fine in a dome, but it's meant to be a personal experience that you have with this space, right? I think that social can be a totally different thing. I think, like, someone else being in a room with you can be represented through weather, or represented through color, or represented through different elements that are in the space. You know, and it could be like, you know, if someone comes in and they have like a bad rating or something, it becomes stormy and you can get out of there, right? I think that there are beautiful ways that we can deal with social that's better. That can be re-represented and go beyond the literal interpretation that we've been having with it. So. I hope that answers all of your questions. Sorry.
Thank you, everybody, for coming this morning.
Yeah,
Jessica's piece is playing, I believe, at 4 o'clock at the Dome today and at 5 o'clock tomorrow. And there's a whole series of other VR projects, including Jessica's Daydream projects, Deep Dream projects. They're in the reality section, just through that passageway over there. Yeah. Hope you guys have all enjoyed this, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.